In the heart of the Wyoming Territory, circa 1880, the wilderness did not possess a heart. It possessed a hunger. Out here, where the earth reaches up to scrape the underbelly of heaven with jagged granite fingers, the wind is not a weather pattern. It is a sentient predator. When the sky turns the color of a bruised plum, and the mercury drops so low that the oil in a lantern thickens into sludge, men do not pray for riches. They pray for the simple mercy of one more shallow breath. This is the high country, a land of brutal crystalline beauty and absolute crushing indifference. It is a place where the line between a living man and a frozen statue is drawn by a single lapse in judgment, a snapped cinch, or a moment of misplaced hope. Have you ever wondered what truly happens to the human soul when it is stripped of every comfort and left to face the raw, unblinking eye of the north wind? Or what kind of man chooses to call such a purgatory his home? Silas was a man who had become a piece of that granite. To the few settlers in the lowlands who dared to speak his name, he was a ghost story whispered over cheap whiskey, the mountain man of the black pine. He was a towering silhouette of buffalo hide and scarred leather, a man who had traded the deceptive warmth of human conversation for the honest, biting cold of the peaks. For 10 years, Silas had lived in a cabin hand-hewn from ancient lightning-struck timber, perched on a ledge that seemed to defy the very laws of gravity. His world was measured in the rhythmic, bone-deep thud of his felling axe and the steady rhythmic breathing of his 3 donkeys, Barnaby, Silas Jr., and Cinder. They were his only anchors to a reality that didn't involve the bitter, haunting memories of a past he had fled a decade ago. They were his family, his scouts, and his silent confidants in a world that had forgotten the sound of his real voice. But on this particular afternoon, as a screaming northern blizzard began to descend, with the weight of a falling mountain, the natural order of Silas's world was irrevocably fractured. The 3 donkeys, usually the most stoic and predictable creatures in the territory, suddenly rebelled. They didn't just stop. They fought him with a primal, frantic energy that defied their training. As Silas tried to lead them toward the shelter of the rock overhang, Barnaby, the eldest, a beast with ears tattered by frostbite, brayed a sound so guttural and agonized it sounded like a human scream echoing through a cathedral of ice. The animals threw their massive weight against the lead ropes, their hooves carving desperate, jagged furrows into the deepening snow. They weren't fleeing the storm. They were being pulled toward the edge of a treacherous ravine, known to the locals as the Devil's Throat. Silas roared at them, his voice raw from the crystalline air, his massive gloved hands tightening on the leather until his knuckles turned white beneath the fur. "Move, you stubborn devils! The frost is coming!" he bellowed, but the donkeys would not budge. They stood their ground, necks strained, eyes wide with a frantic, intelligent terror, looking toward the white void of the abyss. Driven by a volatile mix of fury and a sudden chilling intuition that prickled the back of his neck, Silas stepped toward the ledge. The wind lashed his face like a whip made of diamond dust, blinding him for a moment. Then the wind shifted for a heartbeat. Down in the shadows of the ravine, amidst the shattered, splintered remains of a black lacquered carriage that looked like a broken rib cage against the pristine snow, he saw it. A hand. A small, ungloved hand, pale as a ghost's whisper and delicate as a fallen lily, reaching out from a drift of suffocating white. It was a woman discarded like refuse in the middle of a wasteland where no human soul was ever meant to survive. The sheer, naked injustice of it hit Silas harder than any winter gale. She had been left to die in the one place where God himself seemed to have averted his gaze. As Silas began his perilous sliding descent into the maw of the ravine, his heart, long since encased in layers of defensive ice, suffered its first violent crack. The donkeys hadn't just found a body. They had found the one thing Silas had spent 10 years trying to bury a reason to care. The hunt for survival had ended, and the hunt for the truth had just begun. Part 2. The Encounter. The Giant and the Broken Lily. The descent into the Devil's Throat was not a walk, but a desperate sliding battle against the gravity of the abyss. Silas moved with the heavy, deliberate grace of a mountain lion, his boots carving deep notches into the ice-slicked shale that would have sent a lesser man tumbling to a splintered death. The wind here, trapped in the narrow neck of the ravine, didn't just howl. It shrieked a high-pitched metallic sound that threatened to shatter his very senses. When he finally reached the floor of the canyon, the silence of the snow was absolute, broken only by the ominous groan of twisting metal as the carriage shifted under the weight of the mounting drifts. The wreckage was a grotesque sight, a symbol of high society luxury smashed into toothpicks by the indifferent hammer of the wild. He found her pinned beneath a heavy oak door, the gilded molding of the carriage now nothing more than a mockery of her current plight. She was a vision of Eastern elegance turned into a tragic masterpiece of suffering. Her dress, made of fine midnight blue silk, was shredded and stiff with frozen blood, and her hair, once surely pinned with intricate gold combs, was a tangled web of chestnut and crystalline ice. As Silas knelt beside her, he expected to find a corpse, a cold vessel emptied of its spirit. Instead, he found a pair of eyes, wide, terrified, and flickering with the last stubborn embers of a fierce will to live. As he reached down to lift the door, she didn't cry out. She simply stared at him, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps that frosted in the air like the ghosts of words she couldn't speak. Silas was a mountain of a man, draped in heavy buffalo hides and smelling of wood smoke, old leather, and the raw musk of the high country. His hands, which could crush a man's skull with a single squeeze or snap a sapling like a twig, felt impossibly large and clumsy as he tucked her against his chest. He could feel her heart beating like a trapped bird against his ribs, a tiny, frantic, rhythmic thrumming that seemed to defy the overwhelming, crushing power of the blizzard. In that moment, the contrast was staggering. He was the unyielding granite of the peaks, and she was the delicate, shattered lily of the plains. He didn't know who she was, or what sins had brought her to his doorstep, but he knew that the mountain would not have her this day. The climb back up to the ledge was a testament to Silas's sheer, terrifying physical dominance over the elements. He carried her not as a burden, but as a treasure he had stolen back from the very clutches of the north wind. Every step was a calculated war against the gravity of the slope and the freezing numbness creeping into his own massive limbs. His lungs burned with the intake of ice-cold air, and his muscles screamed under the strain, but he did not falter. When he finally kicked open the heavy pine door of his cabin, the heat from the dying embers of his hearth felt like a physical blow against his face. He laid her down on a bed of soft, thick furs, the firelight casting long, flickering shadows that danced like vengeful spirits across the timbered walls. It was here in the flickering sanctuary of his home that the true grim reality of their encounter took hold. Silas began the clinical task of cutting away her frozen, ruined garments to save her limbs from the black rot of frostbite. As he peeled back the layers of blood-stained silk, he saw the marks. These were not the bruises of a carriage crash. These were the deep purple and jagged furrows of iron shackles around her delicate wrists. She wasn't just a traveler who had lost her way. She was a fugitive, a prisoner who had been hunted and bound long before the mountains ever got a hold of her. Silas looked at his own scarred, weathered hands, then at her fragile, bruised ones. He saw the faint silver scars on her neck, and the way her body instinctively curled into a defensive ball, even in her unconsciousness. The injustice of it curdled the blood in his veins. He realized then that he hadn't just saved a life. He had stepped into the middle of a war he didn't yet understand. He was a man who had spent a decade running from the cruelty of other men, only to have that very cruelty delivered to his hearth by the hands of fate and the instinct of 3 donkeys. He looked out the window at the white wall of the storm, knowing that the mountain had shielded them for now. But the world of men would eventually come knocking, and it wouldn't bring a message of peace. Part 3. The healing and bonding. Scars in bloom. Healing in the high country is not a matter of medicine. It is a grueling marathon of patience and primitive grit. For the first 72 hours, the blizzard held the cabin in a white-knuckled grip, turning the world outside into a featureless void of screaming wind. Inside, the air was thick and heavy, saturated with the scent of pine resin, boiling medicinal herbs, and the metallic tang of drying blood. Silas became a ghost in his own home, moving with a supernatural silence that belied his massive frame. He brewed tonics from the inner bark of willow and the crushed roots of osha, carefully spooning the bitter life-giving liquid into Clara's mouth, while she drifted in and out of a fevered delirium, her lips murmuring names of people and places that belonged to a world Silas had long ago renounced. He tended to her shattered leg, with the grim precision born of necessity, setting the jagged bone with splints of cedar and binding it tight with strips of raw elk hide. Every time he touched her, he felt the tremors that racked her small frame, not just from the cold, but from a deep-seated systemic terror that seemed to have settled into her very marrow. Silas spent his nights sitting by the hearth, his shadow looming like an ancient titan against the timbered walls as he worked on a pair of moccasins for her. He chose the finest, softest buckskin from his winter stores, stitching it with sinew and lining it with the thick, insulating fur of a winter rabbit. He didn't know why he was doing it. Perhaps it was a silent apology for the world that had broken her, or perhaps it was a way to fill the hollow, aching void in his own chest that had been empty for a decade. As the fever finally broke, and the ghost of a flush returned to Clara's cheeks, a new, sharp kind of tension settled over the small cabin. It was the tension of 2 strangers who had shared the most intimate of survival circumstances without knowing the sound of each other's names. Clara began to speak in fragments, her voice a soft, melodic contrast to the gravelly rumble of Silas's rare words. She spoke of a life in Chicago that felt like a half-forgotten dream, a world of operas, gas lights, and high-stakes finance. But that world had a dark, suffocating shadow, and its name was Julian. She described a man of immense polished charm and even greater calculated cruelty, a man who viewed human beings as mere assets to be exploited or liabilities to be liquidated without a second thought. Silas listened in a heavy, brooding silence, his face an unreadable mask of stone, but his eyes blue and piercing as the winter sky betrayed a growing ember of protective rage. He saw the way she flinched at the sudden crackle of a log in the fire, the way her hands instinctively sought her wrists to touch the phantom weight of the shackles that were no longer there. In return for her stories of the city's concrete canyons, Silas offered her the only thing he had: the harsh, honest truth of the mountains. He taught her how to read the shifting patterns of the wind, how to tell the difference between the predatory cry of a hawk and the territorial scream of a mountain lion, and how to find a strange monastic peace in the absolute solitude of the high peaks. The suspicion that had once clouded Clara's gaze like a morning mist began to melt away, replaced by a profound, silent respect for the man who had pulled her from the grave. She realized that his roughness was not a threat, but a shield, a suit of armor forged from isolation to protect a heart that was far too empathetic for the world below. Their bonding was not built on grand gestures or poetic vows, but on the small daily acts of survival. The sharing of a bowl of broth, the steady stoking of the fire against the midnight chill, and the mutual unspoken understanding that some wounds never truly heal. They simply become the terrain upon which we build a new life. As the first spring thaw began to drip from the eaves of the cabin, Silas realized that he was no longer just guarding a patient. He was protecting the first piece of beauty his world had known in a very long time. Part 4, The Twist, the ghosts in the tree line. The arrival of spring in the Wyoming high country is rarely a gentle affair. It is a violent awakening marked by the thunderous crack of ice breaking on the rivers and the roar of snowmelt cascading down the granite faces. But for Silas and Clara, the changing season brought a chill that no hearth fire could ever hope to warm. As the trails cleared and the suffocating white blanket of winter receded, it revealed the dark, wet earth and the first tentative emerald shoots of alpine grass. However, the receding snow also cleared the path for the world. Silas had fled to crawl back up the mountain. One afternoon, while Silas was returning from the high ridges with a brace of grouse, he noticed a change in the air. It wasn't the scent of rain, it was the acrid metallic tang of industrial gun oil and the cloying, expensive aroma of Virginia tobacco. Barnaby, the lead donkey, was pacing his paddock with a frantic, rhythmic intensity, his ears pinned back against his skull and his nostrils flared. He had caught a scent that didn't belong in this pristine wilderness, the scent of men from the city. Inside the cabin, Silas found Clara standing frozen in the center of the room, her face drained of color. On the scarred wooden table sat a small, battered iron box that Silas had recovered from the wreckage weeks ago, but had left unopened out of a sense of privacy. Clara had finally found the courage to pry it open, and the contents were far more dangerous than any cache of gold or jewels. The box was stuffed with meticulously kept ledgers, but they weren't the records of a legitimate business. They were a chronicle of systemic corruption, illegal land seizures, and the cold-blooded liquidation of several whistleblowers who had dared to stand in the way of Julian Thorne's burgeoning empire in Chicago. This ox was the reason she had been shackled in that carriage. It was the reason the driver had been forced off the road at gunpoint before the blizzard hit. Clara wasn't just a victim of an accident. She was the sole living witness to a conspiracy that reached into the highest offices of the territory. She held the fuse that could detonate Julian's entire world, and he was coming to snuff it out. The realization hit Silas like a physical blow to the solar plexus. He wasn't just hiding a woman. He was guarding a political firestorm, and the light was already approaching. From the tree line at the base of the ridge, a group of 6 riders emerged, their silhouettes sharp and menacing against the melting snow. Leading them was a figure in a tailored black suit that looked absurdly, hauntingly out of place in this rugged terrain. Julian Thorne had found them. He hadn't come for his fiancée out of a sense of duty or love. He had come for the ledgers and to ensure that Clara remained a missing person in the archives of history forever. But the twist went deeper, cutting into the very marrow of Silas's own secrets. As Julian rode within shouting distance, he didn't call out for Clara. He called out a name that Silas hadn't heard spoken aloud in over a decade, a name that belonged to a man who had died 1,000 deaths in his own nightmares. "Colonel Silas Vance, I thought you'd be fertilizer in a Virginia trench by now." The mercenaries behind Julian froze their hands hovering over their holsters. They knew that name. Silas wasn't just a hermit. He was a disgraced hero of the Indian Wars, a man who had vanished after refusing to participate in a massacre of non-combatants, a man with a massive bounty on his head for desertion and treason. The past Silas had buried under layers of ice and isolation was now staring him in the face with a sneer. Julian knew about the bounty, and he intended to use it to ensure Silas's silence alongside Clara's. The cabin was no longer a sanctuary. It had become a kill zone. The secret of the branded J on Clara's shoulder and the military records of the man protecting her had collided in a moment of explosive clarity. Silas looked at Clara, then at the Winchester leaning against the doorframe. He realized then that the mountain hadn't just brought them together for healing. It had brought them together to settle a debt with the world of men. The time for hiding was over. The time for the mountain man to become the colonel once again had arrived. Once, the siege of the cabin did not begin with a parley or a demand for surrender. It began with the sharp, clinical crack of a long-range Sharps rifle. The heavy lead slug tore through the seasoned pine door, narrowly missing Silas's head and shattering a clay water jug on the table into 1,000 jagged shards. Silas didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. The moment the shot echoed through the canyon, the mountain man vanished, and the veteran commander of the cavalry returned. He moved with a cold, calculated efficiency, blowing out the lanterns and plunging the cabin into a strategic heavy gloom. "Get under the floorboards, Clara," he growled. His voice no longer a rumble, but a command that vibrated with the authority of a man who had led hundreds into the jaws of death. But Clara didn't move toward the cellar. She moved toward the rack where Silas kept his spare revolvers, her fingers closing around the cold steel of a Colt Peacemaker. "I spent my whole life being told where to hide, Silas," she said, her voice trembling, but her eyes as hard and bright as polished flint. "I'm done hiding." Silas looked at her for a heartbeat, a fleeting moment of recognition between two souls who had decided that death was preferable to a life in chains, and he simply nodded. He handed her an extra box of cartridges and slipped out through the side hatch, vanishing into the shadows of the rocks, like a mountain lion reclaiming its territory. Outside, Julian's mercenaries began to circle the cabin, using the boulders and the remaining mounds of gray snow for cover. They thought they held every advantage, numbers superior firepower, and the arrogance of men who believed they were hunting a broken hermit. They were wrong. Silas knew every inch of this ridge. He knew which stones would roll under a man's weight, and which shadows were deep enough to swallow a human form whole. He didn't engage these in a direct suicidal firefight. Instead, he used the mountain itself as his primary weapon. He had spent years setting deterrents for grizzlies and wolves, and today the predators were two-legged. A tripwire hidden under a dusting of pine needles triggered a tension-loaded log, which swung out from the tree line and swept two of the mercenaries off the narrow cliffside, their screams fading into the abyss of the devil's throat. Another well-placed shot from Silas's Winchester ignited a small cache of blasting powder he had stored for clearing stumps, creating a localized avalanche that split Julian's forces in two. The air became thick with the sulphurous stench of gunpowder and the primal metallic scent of blood. Inside the cabin, Clara held her ground, with a ferocity that would have stunned her former captors. When a mercenary smashed through the rear window, she didn't scream or retreat. She waited until his boots touched the floor and fired 3 shots in rapid succession. The man slumped back into the dirt, and Clara realized in that moment that the woman Julian had tried to break was gone forever. The final confrontation distilled down to the 2 architects of this tragedy. Julian Thorne, his expensive suit now shredded, and his face twisted into a mask of aristocratic fury, found himself face to face with Silas on the very edge of the ridge. The wind whipped between them, carrying the scent of wood smoke and death. Julian held a gold-engraved derringer aimed at Silas's chest, his hand shaking with a volatile mixture of fear and entitlement. "You're a ghost, Vance, a relic of a dead war. You have no right to interfere with my world," Julian shrieked over the howling wind. Silas didn't draw his gun. He simply walked forward, the bullets from Julian's remaining men thudding into the earth around him like harmless hailstones. He looked like an ancient god of the mountain, a force of nature that was indifferent to the petty ambitions of men. He was the embodiment of every injustice Clara had suffered, and every sin Silas had tried to outrun. When he reached Julian, he didn't use a bullet. He redirected the derringer as it fired the muzzle flash, illuminating the cold blue depths of Silas's eyes. Then, with a surge of mountain-bred strength, he gripped Julian by the throat and lifted him off the ground. There was no grand speech, no dramatic monologue of revenge. Silas simply looked Julian in the eyes and saw the hollow cowardice that lived beneath the wealth. With a final decisive heave, he hurled Julian into the white abyss of the ravine, the very place the donkeys had first found Clara. Julian's scream was short-lived, silenced forever by the jagged rocks below, leaving the mountain to reclaim its silence. As the last echoes of the gunfire faded into the vast, indifferent silence of the Wyoming peaks, a profound stillness returned to the ridge. The remaining mercenaries, seeing their benefactor vanish into the depths, fled into the dark timber, leaving behind a world that had been cleansed by fire-lead and the absolute weight of justice. The smoke from the cabin's chimney curled lazily into a morning sky that was no longer the bruised purple of a storm, but a brilliant, hopeful gold. Silas stood on the ledge, his breathing heavy and ragged, his massive body bruised and bloodied, but utterly unbroken. He looked down at his hands, which were covered in the dust of the battle, and felt a sensation he hadn't known in 10 years. The weight of his past had finally been lifted. He wasn't running anymore. Clara emerged from the scarred cabin, her face smudged with soot, and her silk dress a ruin, but her spirit was radiant. She walked to Silas's side on the edge of the abyss and took his hand. There were no words spoken, for none were needed. The iron box and its ledgers had been lost in the fire that consumed the mercenaries' camp. But the truth didn't need paper to exist. It was written in the freedom of their breaths. They were no longer the fugitive colonel and the shackled socialite. They were 2 people who had looked into the unblinking eye of the White Death and refused to flinch. The 3 donkeys, Barnaby, Silas Jr., and Cinder, sensing the danger had passed, brayed in a triumphant, discordant chorus that rang out across the canyon. They had been the unlikely catalysts for this transformation. The humble guides who had insisted on stopping at the exact spot where life and death collided. Silas looked at Barnaby, the old beast who had started it all, and offered a rare, genuine smile that reached his eyes for the first time in a decade. The donkey simply shook his head, ears flopping, and returned to grazing on the fresh emerald shoots of spring grass, as if he had known the outcome all along. In the months that followed, they did not head east to reclaim Clara's stolen fortune. Nor did Silas descend into the valleys to seek a pardon for a name he no longer cared for. They stayed. They rebuilt the cabin, transforming it from a fortress of isolation into a home of sanctuary. They planted gardens where the snowdrifts had once been deepest, and turned the ridge into a beacon for other lost souls who might find themselves caught in the storms of life. On that wild plateau in 1880, a new legend was whispered among the mountain passes. Not a legend of war or wealth, but a legend of two souls who found grace in the most unforgiving place on earth. As the sun set over the Wyoming peaks, casting long golden shadows that stretched toward a future without chains, Silas and Clara stood together watching the horizon. The mountain had taken much from them, but in the end, it had given them the only thing that truly mattered: the courage to be free.